Hey, I'm Sven Genser, Master Student of Information Systems at the University of Münster. In this video series on effective studying, I will equip you with all the information you need to make your studying more effective and fun. This video will lay the foundation for the following videos and will cover an introduction and the topics cognitive biases, understanding the brain, learning, and desirable difficulties. Even in studies where the participants have shown superior results from spaced learning, they don't perceive the improvement. They believe they learned better on the material where practice was masked. This is a striking quote of the book Make It Stick, which this course is based upon. This pattern, that ineffective study strategies are preferred over their more effective implementation, is present across many different study strategies. My goal with this series is to give you all the information you need to make good decisions about your learning. Our mind is riddled with cognitive biases. When we fall prey to the illusion of knowing, there is a significant difference between our feeling and the reality. While not everyone might be aware of it, everyone is affected. Good metacognition, that is, having a realistic judgment of what oneself knows, is critical for effective decision making and learning, and is a skill one must acquire. Ineffective learning strategies, like plain rereading, make you feel like you are on the left, rosy side, while you are actually on the right side of the image, not really making any progress. Effective learning strategies, on the other hand, many examples of which we will see in the following sessions, make you feel like you're on the right side, while you are in fact slowly heading towards the left side. A specific aspect of the cognitive biases is the fact that our memory is not the reality itself, but the reconstruction of it. In this background image, you could see that the large image, or the window, depending on how you see it, is the reality, and the painting, which is drawn by the painter, is the memory, which is constructed by the brain. But not only that, it is also mutable, meaning that it changes over time. On the one hand, it is essential for learning that our brain can encode new information. But on the other hand, many other cognitive biases arise out of it. The hindsight bias, for example, is the tendency to overestimate how much one knew before an event happened. From our current point of view, it makes perfectly sense how we got here. We then extrapolate that knowledge and think that we already knew in the past what we actually only got to know later. This can lead to an overconfidence in one's own abilities. Which brings me to my first question for you. But first, a general note about the questions is that most of the topics we are covering here are not that difficult to understand. But what is difficult is to implement what you've learned here so that it makes a reasonable difference in your life. So I would like you to really take your time to answer these questions and to maybe think about other questions that arise and take your time with answering these questions and trying to implement what you've learned here, because that is what will make a difference, not really getting to know it in the first hand. So, my first question is, where have you already encountered the hindsight bias in the university context or in everyday life? You can now pause the video, think about it, and when you have the answer, you can resume. Obviously, there is not only one answer, there are many different correct answers. The answer I came up with is coming into a tutorial session without working on the exercises beforehand, and then afterwards feeling that the exercises are easier than they actually are, because it is easier to confirm a correct solution when seeing it in the tutorial than to come up with it on your own before you've visited the tutorial and only then seeing the solution. Another example for a cognitive bias is the curse of knowledge. It occurs when we assume that others have the same amount of information that we have, and we thus underestimate how much time is needed for another person to learn something new or to perform a task. Which already brings me to my next question to you. And that is, where is the curse of knowledge important in the university context? Again, pause the video, take yourself some time, and when you have a good answer, resume the video. The answer I came up with is that when teaching others, you should better schedule a bit more time, because when teaching others, it is at least good if you have a bit more knowledge than the person you're teaching, at least in this specific area. And so for them to learn something new, what you've already learned in preparation for the presentation or for the tutorial, takes more time than you might anticipate, because afterwards, when you've learned it, it all makes sense. But before, you first need to piece together the individual pieces. This slide presents the remedies to combat the illusions of knowing. The first one is to use the effective study strategy retrieval, which we will cover in the next video. The second point is to practice like you play, and the quote further goes, because you will play like you practice. That means essentially that we should keep the situation, the environment, similar roughly between when we practice, when we learn, and when we are tested upon what we have learned, for example in the exam. So this means we should not use some aids, for example a calculator, if we are not able to use it in the exam. And in general also not to solve practice exercises with tools like ChatGPT or other assistants. The third remedy is to practice with others, because others might see when you fall prey to a cognitive bias, while you might not see it in yourself. And the last criterion is to be aware of what criteria you use to judge what you have learned. Well, there are some which are better criteria and others which are worse criteria. So a bad criterion would be, for example, the fluency when reading a text, because that fluency increases with the amount of times you reread a text, while rereading is a bad study strategy, but just by itself. But it does not necessarily go along with an increased understanding of the topic. A criterion to judge that accurately might be how well you could explain the topic to another person in your own words, where the person does not have any prior knowledge about the topic, or at least not that much. So my next question is, how might your cognitive biases hold you back? Especially the illusions of knowing, the hindsight bias. And you can also research, there are a lot more cognitive biases out there. So maybe roughly, there are dozens of cognitive biases. And the second question is, how will you combat them? In our brain, we have neurons, which communicate via synapses. They enable our senses, cognition, motor skills, learning, and memory, and thus form the possibilities and limits of our intellectual capacity. While the architecture of the brain is initialized at birth, neuroplasticity, which states that the finer structure of our brain is mutable, enables us to learn. This means that the encoding of new information, that is learning, corresponds to physically altering our brain. A small analogy from the area of deep learning. On a high level, this is very similar to how artificial neural networks learn. We first set the architecture and initialize the parameters in a random way. Then the model learns by looking at training instances and being told what its conclusion should have been by adapting the weights, the fine structure. In this context, Carl Wieman's analogy is quite fitting, that the brain is like a muscle. I quote, "The learning of complex expertise is thus quite analogous to muscle development. In response to the extended strenuous use of a muscle, it grows and strengthens. In a similar way, the brain changes and develops in response to its strenuous extended use. So, we can relate some of our knowledge for physical exercise to cognitive exercises. We keep training, for example, over a longer period, but we are sure to take breaks in between, which is the principle of spacing. And we also vary the kind of exercises that we do, which is the principle of variation. By doing something more often, the pathways the electrical signals travel in the brain become more and more developed, which makes the signals travel faster and faster. This way, gradually, habits are formed. The video Change Your Life One Tiny Step at a Time by Kurzgesagt offers a nice analogy. The brain is like a jungle, and moving through certain parts of the jungle more often makes it easier to do so in the future. This is because the brain's infrastructure is extended exactly there where it is needed. A similar analogy is the network of streets. First, when the demand is very low, the streets may be muddy or not developed for faster travel. When the demand rises, the infrastructure is expanded gradually over time, and people can travel faster. What these analogies clearly convey is that this process takes time. No one would expect such infrastructure to be built in a few days, weeks, or months. What is the consequence for our learning? We need to take our time, and it is best to space our learning over a longer period. Where in your life, possibly in the context of studying, have you encountered the habit formation process? That is, that eventually a sequence of steps got chunked together and can be executed without almost any effort. Examples for that would be the finger movements of musicians, typing on a keyboard, shifting a gear while driving, learning a new language, driving your bicycle, and so on. You'll probably find lots of examples here. Our IQ is determined by our genes and the environment. Thus, contrary to common belief, it is not fixed. While there are many distinctions between kinds of intelligence, a distinction important for us is the one between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence refers to our ability for abstract reasoning, while crystallized intelligence is concerned with concrete knowledge. I encourage you to keep this distinction in mind and be clear about what you are aiming for during learning and what is tested by certain tasks. The human's working memory is the amount of information that can be held in mind while working through a problem, very similar to the RAM in a computer. Even though it is severely limited, it was found that a positive attitude towards learning enables us to make better use of it. Learning can be defined as acquiring knowledge and skills and having them readily available from memory so you can make sense of future problems and opportunities. There are three parts to this definition. First, acquiring the knowledge. Second, remembering it. And third, applying it. There is, especially for us knowledge workers to be, a need to keep learning and remembering for life. Maybe counterintuitively at first, it is well researched that learning is about getting information out of our brain, not in. This means that after the first impression of new information, it helps you learning more to, for example, discuss with your fellow students about the topics or apply the knowledge to new exercises than to reread or rewatch the material. Learning is further an iterative process. We revisit knowledge like a spiral going up and understand more and more every time. Now take yourself some time to think of some examples which show that learning is an iterative process. Your examples could include rereading a dense paper multiple times, while some aspects are immediately clear, others are not, and during the second reading, you build on top of the information you have already got from your first reading. A second example would be in our information system studies, we build up on the knowledge about data or processes in subsequent modules. It would neither make sense to learn all the details in one module, nor listen to subsequent modules first. Another example would be to refine notes step by step to consolidate them into a presentation. And another one, because we can also have physical examples, would be to learn dancing. We can think of knowledge as a network of ideas which are interrelated on many levels. More and intense connections between the chunks of information make it more easily recallable. This is also the case why it is so easy to remember times when something embarrassing happened to us, as we can connect a very strong emotion with it. Choose a course you are attending this semester and create a map of the interrelated topics covered. We will see that exactly this, or in a very similar way, this is also a study strategy that I use, which I call the big picture. To remember new knowledge, you also need to connect it to prior knowledge. Take a look at these two short paragraphs. What stands out to you? Both paragraphs have a lot of technical terms, which refer to concepts the reader may or may not know. With our background in information systems, we can get more information about the programming language C, the second paragraph, if we didn't already know it. Because we know what imperative and functional means, what a type system is, the difference between static and dynamic typing, and so on. The first paragraph, on the other hand, would be useful for someone with a solid background in biology, but not for me. What this example should show is that new learning requires a foundation of prior knowledge. If we want to add something to our tree of knowledge, we need some existing knowledge to connect it to. In class, for example, the lecturer may reference a concept that they assume is common knowledge, but if we don't know exactly what is meant by that, it is in our hands to make the new information digestible to us, for example by asking during the lecture or revising the concept after the lecture. The function depicted here is the forgetting curve, which shows that we exponentially forget most information we consume after a short amount of time. As learning requires memory, it is crucial that we interrupt the forgetting after a proper time interval. For the first revision, the time interval is 1 to a few days, but it also depends on your mastery of the content. We will cover that in more detail in the next session on spacing. On a side note, I suggest that you view failure, in whatever form, as a source of useful information. A positive attitude towards mistakes leads to better learning than a fear of failure. One of the most trivial advice I want to give to you is to ask questions during the lecture if you need clarification. Do not be afraid to ask stupid questions. As the saying goes, there are no stupid questions, only stupid answers, which I totally agree with. Our learning is our own responsibility. Yes, our teachers are here to support and guide us, but at the end it lies in our hands how much we actually take away from the lecture. I want you to realize that the elements shaping your intellectual abilities lie largely within your own control, so own your learning. Take it in your own hands to make the most of the time you are spending on learning, in university as well as elsewhere. And exactly how you do it will be covered in the subsequent videos. What does it take to practice like an expert? First of all, time. Thousands of hours. No one has become a master in their field overnight. But if you do the math, can already get quite far with studying at university, even though we all know that not every single detail we learn here will be of much use in the future. Second, it is important of how we invest this time in deliberate practice. This is practice which is goal-directed, often solitary, and at the edge of our current ability. So it is common, even desired, to feel a little uncomfortable during learning, as this means that you work beyond your current comfort zone and are actively expanding it. Third, it is important to get timely feedback on how we performed, so that we can work on our weaknesses for our next attempts. I'm aware that this is, sadly, not always the case in our lectures, for example, when giving a presentation. In these cases, I recommend you to proactively contact your lecturer to receive feedback. The concept of desirable difficulties states that if you exert more effort during learning, the result is deeper and more durable learning. It is important that the difficulty can be overcome through increased effort, which sets them apart from the undesirable difficulties. The implication is that learning is not better when it's easy. As the book states, when learning is hard, you do important work. And on the other hand, you can add, when it is easy, you could probably let it be. Think back to the analogy that the brain is like a muscle. If you are going to your sports training and only do what is easy, you will not extend your abilities. If you always do the exercises with the same weight, your muscles will not grow. If you always go running with the same speed, the capacity of your heart and lungs will not grow, and so on. Naturally, desirable difficulties are a feature of many effective learning strategies. For retrieval, it is recalling the information from memory instead of reading it again, which is easier. For spacing, it is to delay subsequent study strategies. For interleaving at variation, it is changing the topic of study before having mastered it. Where have you experienced desirable difficulties in your life, and how have they helped you? In nearly every kind of sports training we see that varying the kind of shot, throw, hit or dance move makes it easier to progress, but makes it more difficult to do the thing actually right now. Or not practicing only a few days before a match, but throughout the whole season. Or learning how to perform a task using a new tool. Public speaking in front of larger and larger groups. And all of that. The advantages of desirable difficulties are that they mimic the challenges of practical experience, following the principle, practice like you play, which I already mentioned a few minutes ago. It helps creating mental models by strengthening the learning of concepts and their transferability. The main difference, and which is a quite huge difference, sadly, is that they feel less productive due to the illusions of knowing and also other reasons. This makes us students intuitively steer away from them instead of towards them. The purpose of this and the following sessions can be summarized as convincing you to adopt the desirable difficulties based on scientific research instead of avoiding them based on your intuition. Let us summarize. What makes strategies effective or ineffective, and why? First, the first aspect is it popular, intuitive, or mainly, does it feel productive, which makes it popular and intuitive? For the ineffective study strategies, this is a yes, which I refer to the quote of the beginning, that even when people know about the effective learning strategies, that some still prefer the ineffective ones. For the effective study strategies, there is a no, because they, as I just mentioned, don't feel productive because of the illusion of knowing and the desirable difficulties. The developed strength is for ineffective study strategies a momentary strength. And for effective study strategies, it is an underlying habit strength, which one could also call mastery, which is obviously what we mainly aim for. We don't want to be good only for the exam, but we want to know the knowledge that we've obtained for the exam also later for our job, at least for the topics which are relevant for us. Third one is what I already hinted at, is that ineffective study strategies do not implement the desirable difficulties, while effective study strategies implement desirable difficulties. The illusions of knowing are thus counterbalanced by the effective ones, and they are promoted by the ineffective study strategies. And the primary mode your brain is in is, for ineffective ones, passive. For example, absorbing the information when reading the material again or watching the lecture or video again. For the effective ones, it is an active mode. Your brain is actively working to retrieve the information, which is exactly what we want. So, let's summarize. And sorry for the very text-heavy slide, but I think it's important that we see all of that now. First, the cognitive biases that we have learned about affect everyone, but can be combated with effective learning strategies. Our brain is physically and chemically altered by the process of learning. It can be trained like a muscle. Usually, I think, when we think of it the first time, it's sort of this abstract process that we form a more and more accurate knowledge of something, but it is actually because our brain is physically altered. Then learning is an iterative process, which consists of the initial acquisition of knowledge, then memorizing it, and thirdly applying it to new problems. And our knowledge can be seen as a network of interrelated concepts. The last advice is that you should be prepared to encounter difficulties during learning, because they are an inherent part of it. So, that's it for the first video. Feel free to check out the next two videos, which will go into a bit more depth into the actual practical implementation of the topics. Because these foundational topics were rather dry. In the next sessions, you will get hands-on advice on how to implement what you've now learned in theory. Then, happy learning!